Hello and welcome to Children's Time. It's good to be with you again this week. This week we're going to hear about the end of Moses' story. And while the story about the Israelite people will continue to go on for generations, and we can read about what happens to them in the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament of the Bible, Moses' story ends in a book called Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is the fifth book of the Bible in the Old Testament. And that's where we hear about how Moses' story comes to an end. If you remember last week, we talked about that Moses was up on this mountain called Sinai, and that he received these instructions from God on how to build this special tent called the tabernacle. And this tent was where God was going to live with the people of Israel as they continued their journey through the wilderness. As they kept walking, they were going to pack up this tent and take it with them and set it up everywhere they went. And that's what they did. And that helped them know that God was always with them. Now, as they continued this journey, this walking in the wilderness, it went on for 40 years. They spent 40 years walking in the wilderness, trying to get to this land that God had promised them would be their home. And what was happening was that while they were walking in the wilderness, they kept messing up. They kept making mistakes. They kept doing exactly what God told them not to do. They kept breaking God's laws. And because of that, they had to keep walking in the wilderness. They weren't allowed to go into that land that God had promised them until they could kind of get it together as a people. But the problem was that just never happened. And so because of that, a whole generation of people were not allowed to go into that promised land that God had set aside for them to be their home. And so what happened was that after a whole generation had died, this new generation comes, and they're the ones that are going to get to go into the promised land. And so in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses gives them a speech. He talks to them about the importance of following God's laws. He talks to them about listening for God and loving God with all of their hearts and minds and souls. And he promises them that even when they do mess up, God will still be with them. That they should always look to God. And then he gives them a beautiful poem. And then Moses goes up to this thing called a plain. So essentially it's like a flat-topped mountain, if you want to think of it that way. God takes Moses up there, and God shows Moses the land where this new generation is going to be able to go and finally make their home after 40 years. And God says to him up there, "This is the land that I promised to your ancestors, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, with the words, 'I will give it to your descendants.' I've let you see it with your own eyes. There it is, but you're not going to go in." So Moses, like the rest of the Israelites, has also made a lot of mistakes. And so he has to face the consequences of his actions. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't love him anymore, or that God abandons him. God is with him until the very end. Up on that plain, in the land of Moab, it's called, Moses died. And God buried him in the land of Moab. And Moses was supposedly 120 years old when he died. But the book of Deuteronomy says his eyesight was sharp. He still walked with a spring in his step. And the people of Israel, the Israelites, they wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. And so the people were sad. They were sad because Moses had died. And so they were grieving him, right? So when someone dies, in our culture we have a funeral, and a lot of times we cry. Sometimes we laugh and we talk about good memories that we've had with those people. And that's sort of what the Israelites did out there in the wilderness as well. They thought about Moses and they cried for him, and they talked about him. And this whole time, they were waiting to see what would happen next. And now they need a new leader because Moses has died. And so a man named Joshua comes, and he is filled with the spirit of wisdom that Moses had. And he becomes the new leader for the people of Israel. And he's the one who's going to take this new generation of Israelites and take them into the land that God had promised to give them as their home. And the book of Deuteronomy ends by saying that there was never again anyone like Moses among the people of Israel. Moses was someone special. He had a special connection to God and to the people, and he was able to tell the people everything that God was telling him. And so the people will remember Moses in that way. And that's why we have his story in the Bible, because he was such a very special person, and he had this special connection to God. And so we remember him to this day and his story. And through his story, we can hear the words that he left to the generation that was allowed to go into the land. He told them God will always be with them, even when you mess up, even when you run away from God. God will not run away from you. God will love you and stay with you and never leave you. And he charged them, which means he called to them and asked them to make sure that they were able to keep going and to love God with all their hearts and minds and souls. And so that's what we're called to do too. We're called to love God, to love one another, and we can do that remembering that God never lets us go. And be with me in prayer. Dear God, thank you for the story of Moses and people like Moses. Thank you for the reminder to always love God, and that God will be with us no matter what. God will always love us and never leave us. Amen. Well, it was good to be with you again this week, and I'll see you next week on Children's Time.